What a narcissistic woman fears most is not exposure through confrontation, arguments, or public conflict. It is something far more unsettling, being seen clearly without a single word being spoken. When a good man walks away quietly, without explanations, accusations, or emotional outbursts, he removes the very stage on which narcissistic behavior survives. There is no drama to exploit, no reaction to feed on, no chaos to twist into a narrative that protects her image. Silence, in this context, is not weakness. It is psychological finality. From a Jungian perspective, the narcissistic personality is deeply invested in maintaining a constructed self, a persona designed to secure admiration and control. This persona collapses when it is no longer reflected back through emotional engagement. A good man who refuses to argue, justify, or plead becomes an unexpected mirror, one that reflects absence instead of validation. And absence is terrifying to someone who depends on constant external confirmation of worth. What unsettles her most is not that others might eventually see the truth, but that he sees it and no longer needs to announce it. His calm withdrawal communicates something devastatingly simple. I understand who you are, and I no longer consent to participate. The illusion doesn't shatter loudly. It dissolves quietly, which makes it impossible to defend against. This is why silence after clarity is so powerful. It denies manipulation oxygen. It leaves no emotional fingerprints to exploit, and it forces the narcissistic mind into an unfamiliar space, one where control is lost and introspection becomes unavoidable. A good man does not expose a narcissist by fighting her. He exposes her by becoming unreachable. And when you choose silence rooted in self-respect, remember this: the most powerful truth is the one you no longer need to explain. One of the most destabilizing moments for a narcissistic woman occurs when she realizes she no longer controls the story. For a long time, the narrative has been her strongest weapon. She defines what happened, who was hurt, and who is to blame. Facts become flexible, emotions are edited, and reality is reshaped to preserve her self-image. What she fears most is not being challenged directly, but being deprived of the chance to rewrite events at all. From a psychological standpoint, narrative control functions as emotional dominance. As Carl Jung observed, the ego will distort reality to avoid confronting the shadow. When a good man stops explaining himself, stops defending his character, and stops trying to correct misunderstandings, he quietly removes himself from the story she depends on. There is no dialogue left to manipulate, no reaction to provoke, no version of events to argue against. His refusal to participate becomes a silent declaration of independence. This is deeply unsettling because the narcissistic mind relies on conflict to stay in power. Conflict creates motion, and motion allows her to shift roles, from aggressor to victim, from responsible to misunderstood. But when he remains grounded and disengaged, the narrative freezes. Others begin to notice the consistency of his calm versus the instability of her explanations. Truth, when left alone, has a way of revealing itself without assistance. What frightens her most is that his silence allows reality to stand on its own. She can no longer position herself as the center of meaning. The audience, friends, family, even her own inner voice, begins to sense the gaps in the story. And gaps invite reflection. A good man doesn't win by telling his side louder. He wins by stepping out of the story entirely. And when you stop trying to control how you are perceived, you give truth the space to speak for you. Perhaps nothing is more disorienting to a narcissistic woman than the moment she senses true emotional detachment. Not anger, not resentment, not even disappointment, but a quiet inner withdrawal. Anger still signals attachment. Hurt still implies investment. Emotional detachment, however, communicates something far more threatening. Indifference rooted in clarity. It tells her she no longer occupies psychological space in his inner world. From a Jungian lens, Narcissism depends on projection. The narcissistic individual projects an idealized image onto others and then feeds on their emotional responses to sustain that image. A good man who emotionally disengages interrupts this loop. He stops reflecting her back to herself, and when the mirror is removed, the narcissistic psyche is forced into an unfamiliar confrontation with emptiness. This is where the fear emerges. Detachment cannot be negotiated with. It cannot be guilted, provoked, or seduced back into engagement. The usual strategies, charm, blame, victimhood, or sudden affection, lose their power when they no longer register emotionally. The good man's calm presence, paired with emotional distance, creates a paradox the narcissistic mind struggles to process: access without influence. What intensifies this fear is that emotional detachment is irreversible once it is authentic. It signals that he has already integrated the lesson. He is no longer trying to be understood. He is no longer waiting for change. He has reclaimed his emotional energy and redirected it inward, toward stability rather than survival. In Jungian terms, this is the moment individuation begins. He separates his identity from the relationship's chaos and reclaims authorship of his inner life. And that independence is deeply unsettling to anyone who once relied on emotional dependency for power. Emotional detachment is not cruelty, it is clarity in motion. And when you no longer react, you quietly teach others that your peace is not negotiable. Another fear quietly takes hold when a narcissistic woman observes the good. Man's life improving without her presence. Not dramatically, not performatively, but steadily and authentically. His growth is not announced, yet it becomes visible in his posture, his decisions, and the calm authority with which he now moves through the world. This progression is deeply unsettling because it contradicts a core narcissistic belief that she was the source of his confidence, purpose, or value. From a Jungian perspective, this strikes at the heart of the false self. Narcissism depends on the fantasy of centrality, the belief that others derive meaning through proximity. When the good man begins to flourish independently, it exposes a painful truth she has long avoided, that his strength was always his own, merely suppressed, not created by the relationship. His growth becomes an unspoken indictment of the dynamic they shared. What makes this particularly threatening is that growth, without resentment, leaves no opening for manipulation. If he were bitter, she could frame herself as the cause of his pain. If he were vengeful, she could cast herself as the victim. But when his evolution is calm and self-directed, there is nothing to distort. His life becomes evidence that separation was not a loss, but a necessary condition for integration. In Jungian terms, this is the movement toward individuation, the process of becoming whole, by reclaiming disowned parts of the self. The good man begins to embody traits that were once diminished: assertiveness, boundaries, self-trust. And as he integrates these aspects, he no longer fits the role that once sustained her sense of superiority. This is why his growth unsettles her more than his anger ever could. Growth is permanent. It cannot be undone by apology or charm. It signals that he has outgrown the psychological terrain where control once existed. When you choose growth over grievance, you do more than heal, you transcend. And nothing is more threatening to a broken dynamic than a person who no longer needs it to define who they are. There is a common assumption that a narcissistic woman fears being replaced by another woman. But what she truly fears is something far more destabilizing: being replaced by a man's self-respect. Another relationship still keeps her relevant. Another partner keeps the emotional circuitry alive. But self-respect ends the cycle entirely. It removes her from the equation. From a psychological standpoint, self-respect introduces boundaries, and boundaries dissolve narcissistic leverage. Where there were once explanations, there is now refusal. Where there was once emotional bargaining, there is now quiet certainty. The good man no longer negotiates his worth. He no longer seeks permission to protect his time, energy, or values. And this shift is deeply threatening because it signals the end of access. In Jungian terms, this is the reintegration of the self. The man retrieves the parts of his psyche that were compromised in the relationship, his instincts, his judge, meant his capacity to say no without guilt. These reclaimed aspects form an inner authority that cannot be manipulated from the outside. The narcissistic dynamic collapses not because she is rejected, but because she is no longer needed to validate identity. What intensifies this fear is that self-respect is visible without being announced. It shows up in what he tolerates and what he walks away from. It is present in the absence of explanations, the consistency of boundaries, and the calm with which he disengages from disrespect. There is no dramatic closure, only a quiet withdrawal of access. This is why self-respect feels like replacement. It occupies the emotional space she once controlled. It provides the stability and affirmation that he previously sought externally, and once that internal structure is in place, her influence becomes irrelevant. A narcissistic woman may replace a man quickly, but she cannot compete with a man who has replaced chaos with self-respect. And when you choose dignity over attachment, you don't just leave a relationship. You reclaim yourself. At the deepest level, what a narcissistic woman fears most is not abandonment, rejection, or even irrelevance. It is being left alone with herself. When the good man exits without hostility or desperation, he removes the final distraction that protected her from self-reflection. There is no one left to provoke, blame, or emotionally drain. And in that silence, something unavoidable begins to surface. Wrong. A Jungian perspective, this is the confrontation with the shadow, the disowned aspects of the psyche that have been buried beneath charm, control, and performance. Narcissistic behavior is often a defense against this encounter. As long as there is someone to manage emotionally, the inner reckoning can be postponed. But when the relationship ends cleanly, the avoidance strategy collapses. What remains is the self, unfiltered and unmirrored. This is deeply unsettling because introspection threatens the carefully constructed persona. Without an external emotional anchor, cracks begin to appear. Regret may emerge, not always for the harm caused, but for the growing sense of emptiness that no validation can fully repair. The absence of the good man becomes a psychological vacuum, one that forces awareness rather than comfort. What intensifies this fear is that introspection cannot be controlled the way people can. It arrives quietly, often at night, in moments of stillness. There is no audience to impress, no reaction to provoke. Only patterns, memories, and questions that demand honesty. And honesty is the one terrain where narcissism has no defenses. For the good man, this final stage is not about revenge or closure. It is about completion. His departure initiates a process he no longer needs to witness. He moves forward, integrated and self-directed, while she faces a crossroads, growth or continued fragmentation. True power is not in winning or being remembered. It is in leaving someone with themselves, and leaving yourself free.